Welcome to the Brand and Market Podcast, where branding clarity meets marketing strategy. I'm your host, Allie Haney, founder of Brand and Market, a boutique agency dedicated to helping small businesses craft intentional brands and effective marketing plans. Each week, I share practical tips and insights to help you, especially those of you in real estate-related industries, build a standout brand to attract your brand's biggest fans. Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Brand and Market Podcast. A couple weeks ago, we chatted about our very first short-term rental that was never actually purchased and meant or intended to be a short-term rental. And now it's time for the story of our second home that we purchased that was never intended to be a short-term rental. It's been kind of a theme in our lives that the properties that we've purchased were not intended to be what they ended up being. So we're going to follow down that path today as we talk about our Kentucky property. If you remember from the previous episode, our first short-term rental was in North Carolina. It was the very first home that we purchased together, and that turned into from our primary home to a long-term rental. Long-term rental we didn't have a very good experience with, so we turned it into a short-term rental. That ran as a short-term rental for 2 years. And once we moved to Kentucky and purchased that property, we ended up selling the home in North Carolina so that we were able to have some cash to get that business in Kentucky up off the ground. So let's talk a little bit more about the Kentucky property. The Kentucky property was originally purchased to be a wedding venue. It's on 90 acres. The main home is about 6,000 square feet, 5-bed, 5.5 bath. Absolutely breathtaking property. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a second. And if you want to hear more about the wedding venue misadventure, I've done a complete episode all about the behind the scenes goings on of that property. And I will link that episode in the show notes if you want to get a little bit more tea on that. But I'm going to kind of give you the very short Reader's Digest version of what we intended for that property to be and now what it is. Like I said, we purchased that property in Kentucky in 2021. We had grand visions of it being a wedding venue, a luxury wedding venue where we did have overnight guests because the guests would be renting it out over the full weekend. And despite our best due diligence before putting in an offer and going under contract on that property, the permitting process did not go as planned. That permitting process started about 2 weeks after we closed on the property. So August to September of 2021, we were going through the process to get a conditional use permit for the property. And it was, we ended up getting the permit to run it as a wedding venue. However, with conditional use permits, the county can put restrictions on said permit. And we had 18 restrictions. I think the average before us was maybe like 1 or 2, and we were strapped with 18 restrictions on our property. And it wasn't until about maybe the springtime, I want to say it was like April of 2022, so close to 7, 8, 9 months after we closed on the property, that's when I finally had the realization that this idea was not going to work out. And if it did work out, it certainly wasn't going to work out the way that I anticipated it working out. So we had to decide what we were going to do with the property. Were we going to sell it immediately, less than a year after purchasing it? Or were we going to try and find another use for it for the meantime until we could, decide whether we wanted to keep it or get rid of it? So that's when we decided, okay, well, we already have this permit that says that people can stay overnight for weddings. Let's go ahead and use it as a short-term rental. With that being said, a little bit more about the property is that there is a guest house on this same property, 90 acres. It's within sight distance of the original, or the main house rather. And that home is... The previous owners called it the carriage house. So it was an apartment above a garage. It was 2-bed, 1 bath, little less than 1,000 square feet. And so at that time, in May of 2022, that's when we moved into the guest house. And I was expecting our third baby in about 3 months. I was due with baby number 3 in August of 2022. It was at that time that we began putting the Airbnb listing live to start welcoming our first guests. Again, we had some pushback from neighbors because originally the permit was for overnight guests that were from weddings. They weren't specifically Airbnb guests. So we did have to go back in front of the county to get an additional conditional use permit. And that permitting process was in, I guess, about June or July of 2022. We ended up hosting our very first guests in July of 2022 before I had that baby in August. And that was a learning experience, a learning curve, because we had intended to have our third baby naturally. That did not go as planned. There was an emergency C-section thrown in there as we were trying to host some guests. We ended up having to block out certain dates in that August timeframe so that I could recover in the main house, so I didn't have to climb stairs to that apartment above the garage. So that was quite the adventure. But let's dive back into the short-term rental world. A couple of lessons that we learned as we created that property. First one is that you can never be too diligent when purchasing a property in a new place or a new area. Like I said, we did our absolute best to be prepared and do our due diligence prior to putting in an offer and going under contract on that property. We had spoken to the zoning office. They had told us that they didn't anticipate any issues, although they could not promise us that, which is good because if they had, there's probably going to be a lawsuit for them. But we, looked at the other wedding venues in the area. They had no issue getting their conditional use permits. And with that being said, there were only 2 others in the whole county. And none of them were directly next to us. They were all on opposite ends of the county. Like I said, the maybe max conditions that they were put under was 4, one of which was just that they had to, be safe and abide by the sound laws for the county as a whole. So would have dug a little bit more, not only into the zoning, but I would have done a little bit more research on the community itself. Because once we got there, the community showed us a little bit more about who they were. And I would have been able to figure that out had I dug a little deeper. One way that I would suggest doing this, if you're thinking about buying a property in a new area, is to join the local Facebook groups. Those local Facebook groups give a lot of insight into the type of people that live in a specific area. And I don't want to paint, the county that we were in a bad light. It is a very rural county. And they just generally did not like having people that were from outside of the county come into their county. And they certainly didn't like people coming outside the county into the county to add more commerce to the county. So if I had done a little bit more research into the community itself, I probably could have figured that out. However, I didn't know that was something that I should have done, needed to do, should have been aware of. It was just a total blind spot because I had never done anything like that before. Taking it back to our first short-term rental, we didn't have a choice but to move there. We were given orders to Camp Lejeune. So we had to move somewhere in that eastern North Carolina area. And we chose an area that was near the beach. So that was the decision-making process for that because that was going to be our primary home. This was a little bit different because it was going to be a large investment. Now I know that if I am seriously thinking or considering purchasing a home for an investment, especially for hospitality purposes, that I need to do more research outside of just the potential attractions to the area. It's in a great location in terms of the Bourbon Trail, right? This Kentucky property is 50 minutes from downtown Louisville, an hour from Lexington, 45 minutes from Frankfort, and 25 minutes from Bardstown, which is the bourbon capital of the world. We are very centrally located in all of the Bourbon Trail. However, the attractions are not enough to know that we were building a business that would thrive in that area. We, of course, found the gem that is the short-term rental industry, and that thrives there. However, the wedding venue that we wanted to initially do was not going to thrive there. So let's talk about transitioning over from the wedding venue into the short-term rental space. Some of these things kind of overlap, specifically the interior design of the property. So let's dive into that first, because remember I said we had that first permit process that started in September of 2021. And the second permit process wasn't until about June or July of 2022. But within that time, I was still trying to figure out the next steps we needed to take in order to make it a wedding venue and be able to accommodate overnight accommodations. And of course, what's the first thing we'd have to do is to furnish the home, right? I had looked into a couple of different interior designers. At that point, I did not realize that there were interior designers that specialized in short-term rentals. If I had known that, I would have gone directly to them. However, we also were working on a pretty lean budget to furnish that house. Like I said, it's 5 bedrooms, 5.5 baths, 6,000 square feet. It takes a lot of furniture to furnish 6,000 square feet. We were figuring out how to do that once we realized that we couldn't have afforded the designer. So we ended up DIYing that interior design. All in for all of the furnishings, the linens, the kitchen supplies, we were sitting right at about $45,000. And we splurged on some things. We pulled some things from like our own personal furniture and then did the design of the interior, like the bedrooms, the higher touch areas, like the beds, the mattresses, etc. Like we splurged a little bit on that because that's what has the most impact on short-term rental stays. But one of the things that I wanted to touch on was how we built the brand a little bit more within the walls of the short-term rental itself. So when I was doing the branding for the wedding venue, that was easily translatable, thankfully, over to the short-term rental. So I had already given the property a name and wanted to do a theme within the home itself. So the name of the wedding venue was the Commonwealth, and that name we kept when we converted it over into a short-term rental. And the reason that we chose the name the Commonwealth is because there are 4 states that are Commonwealths in the United States, and we are from one of them, which is Virginia, and we were moving to and creating this property in another of them, which is Kentucky. The other 2 are Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, and there are 4 bedrooms in that house that have ensuite bathrooms. So the 4 bedrooms that had the ensuite bathrooms were all going to be themed individually by, using the inspiration from a Commonwealth state. For example, Pennsylvania is known for its iron, and so or steel, I guess. I don't know if that's the same thing, but we found a wrought iron bed for that specific bedroom bed frame. And so that was bringing in and pulling in some of the inspiration from that state. For each of those 4 states, I looked up the colors of that state, and I think it was Pennsylvania as well. It was like pink and navy blue. So I pulled in, accent pillows of light pink, blush pink, got a navy blue comforter, like certain things like that. So I pulled in specific inspiration from each of those Commonwealth states to tie into the bedroom to create an overall theme and thus a brand. So I thought that was a really fun way to differentiate the Kentucky short-term rental. Of course, Virginia was fun to do because that's where we're from. I pulled a lot of inspiration from like Colonial Williamsburg for that room. So we had some like deep greens, like anytime you Google Colonial Williamsburg, you'll see like the green that I'm talking about. But we had this like beautiful deep green dresser in there. And then a lot of like the pink, like dogwood inspired accent colors in the pillows and the comforter as well. And then of course with the Kentucky room, we had horses in there. Without being too cliche though, like I didn't want overwhelming horse decor. But they had, the previous owners had this really beautiful antique furniture set because the master bedroom, which was the Kentucky themed one, has this like sitting room area. And that sitting room area has that antique set, and it's like a deep yellow, like velvet fabric on top of like dark wood accents. And for those of you who don't know, the Kentucky state flower is the goldenrod. And so that really pulled in the goldenrod like theme from that state. So it's a lot of like really simple, subtle touches that if you didn't have the brand story behind it, it probably wouldn't make much sense. But with like looking through that brand's lens, it really brings together the story of the whole home, which is really cool. Are you feeling stuck when it comes to your branding or marketing strategy? Do you have a million ideas but no clear direction on where to start? Then it sounds like a Power Hour session would be perfect for you. This is a focused one-on-one video call designed to tackle your biggest branding or marketing challenges. Here's how it works. You schedule a call, share some of your business details and any burning questions you have ahead of time. Then during our session, we dive straight into solutions. No fluff, no generic advice, just tailored strategies that work for you and your business. Whether you're a realtor looking to stand out in a crowded market, a short-term rental owner creating a repeat guest experience, or a builder needing clarity on your messaging, the Power Hour is designed to help you walk away with actionable steps to grow your brand. Are you ready to take the guesswork out of your branding and marketing? Let's tackle it together. Visit the link in the show notes to book your Power Hour session today, and let's turn your ideas into intentional action. Okay, so let's get us back on our timeline. In July of 2022, right before I was about to have a baby, that's when we opened up booking and we began booking almost immediately. We had our first 3 bookings within the first week. Thanks for the Airbnb algorithm. They like to push those new listings to the top of the pile, but we ended up being able to stay at the top of the listings because we are now going on. I started hosting the first property in November of 2018 and have not lost my Superhost status since. So with that, we have been able to maintain like our higher listing status on Airbnb, which has been really great. And one of the strategies that I use, we have a perfect 5-star rating on the Kentucky property. And one of the strategies that I use is upon checkout, I actually ask for that 5-star rating. Like I send them a message. They check out at 11. They get a message around 1 when they're still like traveling home and kind of on their high of their trip. And I just, touch base with like, I really hope that you had a great stay here on the Bourbon Trail. You got to see some Southern hospitality. Safe travels as you head home today. If there were any issues during your stay, I would love to be able to address those directly so that we can maintain our 5-star review rating. And I say it in like a really kind way where it's like, I still want to address any concerns that you possibly could have had. However, I want to also maintain my professionalism and show the world what we have to offer by keeping our 5-star rating. So that is one thing that I wanted to touch on today's episode. Since then, we have run that as a short-term rental. Like I said, since July of 2022, we had a small period of time right after I recovered from that emergency C-section in August that we were down and didn't book anything. And then I had another surgery in February of 2024, and I stayed in the main house for the recovery of that surgery. So the month of February, I believe, like February 6th to the end of the month. So like 2.5 weeks, 3.5 weeks in February that we did not have bookings. But outside of those 5-ish weeks, there have been bookings very, very steadily since July of 2022. So coming up on 3 years now. We actually moved from the area. We no longer live in Kentucky in March of 2024, right after I had that surgery. And we've been running that short-term rental remotely ever since. We were able to find tenants who are living in that guest house now. And so although I do the vast majority of management, coordinating cleaners, making sure supplies are there, those types of things, if there's any type of like emergency service that needs to be done, they are gracious enough to be able to step in and do that. So for example, I can tell you recently, it's very rare that we have a same day check-in, check-out and check-in. Just due to the nature of the Bourbon Trail, people tend to come for like 4 to 5 days, and then we'll have 2 days open before the next set comes in. So it's very rare that we have those same day turnovers. However, it's happened, maybe 4 or 5 times in the last 3 years. And the most recent same day turnover, we had a toilet emergency, a plumbing emergency. It all turned out well. Everyone was fine. There were no major issues. But, just having the tenants there that were able to let the plumber in and just be another set of eyes. For example, the plumbers had to remove a toilet to be able to snake deep down in the lines. And so the second set of guests were about to check in. they did end up getting stuck in traffic. So I think it was like a little bit of a God wink because the tenants were like, the cleaners had already come and cleaned and reset the whole house. But when they pulled that toilet out, left a little bit of splash there. So we were able to have the tenants from the guest house come in and help us make sure that it was in pristine condition before the second set of guests checked in. So there have been, a couple of little hiccups that's to be expected with any type of property management. But for the most part, we've been able to manage it remotely. And that's really kind of set me on fire to find a couple of different co-hosting opportunities. So if you know someone that has a short-term rental that is looking to bring on a co-host, I would absolutely love to be considered because like I said, I've been doing this since 2018, almost 7 years now, and have found some systems that make things run really smoothly. And I am just a little sponge. I'm a lifelong learner and love to continuously find ways to make things more efficient and more profitable. I wanted to touch a little bit on who our ideal guest avatar is. And if you had asked me who this person was before this, I did not sit down and have somebody in mind when we actually designed the house. I did. It was a bride. It wasn't the person that I was thinking of in terms of short-term rentals. But after having been in it for 3 years, I have found the person that we naturally attract based off of the architecture of the home, the location. And so now having that knowledge, I've been able to kind of tailor what we do to welcome the guests to be able to cater specifically towards that ideal guest avatar. So I want to dive into who that person is. And it's less a single person and more a group of people. But what we've seen is that the people that gravitate towards the Kentucky property are usually groups of couples. And those couples are usually lifelong friends. Sometimes they met in high school. Sometimes they met in college. Sometimes they became friends when their kids were young. But it's like a long-standing relationship, and they're using our property to have some sort of reunion. They haven't seen each other in a while. Maybe it's a year, maybe it's 5 or 10 years, but they're coming to our property to really enjoy each other's company as well as have an experience on the Bourbon Trail. 9 times out of 10, they are visiting the Bourbon Trail and they're incorporating that into their visit. So a few things that we do to help their trip to be the best that it can be is first, when they initially book, we send them a welcome message that gives them the contact information for a couple of different local tour bus companies so that they can have a designated driver as they get liquored up across the Bourbon Trail. Don't want any drunk drivers coming to our area. So we make sure that they have that information, that they're able to book that. And therefore that allows them to be able to have the best time that they can without having to risk any safety or have any safety concerns. Next, we give them our recommendations of the distilleries that have the best tours. So within that ideal client avatar, there are usually 2 different types of travelers. Like the first group is the ones that actually love bourbon. So they're the ones that they drink bourbon every night as a nightcap. They drink it with, while smoking a cigar. They really enjoy the taste notes of the bourbon. They can tell you whether it's sweet or rye-based, corn-based, like they can tell you, right? The other subset is that they're just along for the ride and they just want to cross the Bourbon Trail off their bucket list. They're just here for a good time. So I am the second type of traveler. I'm the one that's there for the good time. My husband is the one that's actually the bourbon connoisseur. So after having gone and visited many of the distilleries while we lived there, I have a subset for each type of those travelers. I know which ones are all like the best, most entertaining tours that's going to like be fun and informative and engaging. And then he has the ones that like, okay, if they like, rye bourbon, then they're going to wheat. Wheat is sweet. Okay, I got to remember that. Wheat is sweet. If they like wheat-based bourbon, then these are the places that they want to go to. Anyway, all that to say, we have personalized recommendations based off of what their priorities are. And then the last thing is we supply them with a Bourbon Trail guide at the property upon check-in so that they can continue to plan their trip accordingly. Many have already done it, or they've booked a tour with one of those tour buses that does that for them. But they still they enjoy like looking through the rest of the distilleries, even if they're not visiting them. yeah, that's a little bit more insight into our experience into creating a property into a short-term rental that was never intended on being a short-term rental. Well, thanks for tuning in today, guys, to another episode of the Brandon Market Podcast. It's been fun walking down memory lane with y'all. I am going to link in the show notes that previous episode about the wedding venue and all of the zoning headaches that we went through with that. And if you would like to book a power hour call with me, I am going to link that down in the bottom show notes as well, so that we can chat about your short-term rental or about your personal brand as a realtor and how we can make that even better than it already is. Thanks, guys. Take care. You just completed another episode of the Brandon Market Podcast. If you found this helpful, please rate, review, and subscribe to help others find this show and so that you never miss an episode. Don't forget to take a look at the show notes for all the resources mentioned today. See you next Wednesday, and as always, I'm here cheering you on as you build your dream brand and business.